Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon. I'm Cynthia Sang, partner at Fairview Capital. It is my pleasure today to welcome you to our series of interviews with thought leaders to discuss topics most relevant to society today and how it directly impacts the way we invest. Today, I am pleased to have our guest, Dr. Erica Shirley, clinical psychologist at Howard University, to help us unpack a really complex topic, which is mental health, but more specifically, how to maintain mental wellness during the COVID-19 pandemic. But this also relates to how mental wellness technology platforms can be utilized during this time. Can you give our audience some background information about, your professional background and what you do at Howard University?
Sure. So as you were saying, I'm a clinical psychologist and I am a staff psychologist at Howard University's counseling service. So essentially that's the university's counseling center where we see all of enrolled Howard University students from undergraduate to graduate students. And we see them, for basically a range of concerns, mostly depression and anxiety within that realm, but of course, other concerns having to do with school-related issues such as academic concerns, also to more intense diagnoses such as post-traumatic stress disorder, oftentimes around this time in development between 18 to 21, if someone is predisposed to having a psychotic break or if they're predisposed to having bipolar disorder or schizophrenia, usually it's around this time of life that people may display the initial symptoms. So oftentimes we're on the front line, so to speak, if someone unfortunately is predisposed to having that kind of disorder. And then part-time, I also have a private practice. So I like to balance my age group. So I have mostly my full-time job is with college students at Howard University. Prior to that, I worked at Georgetown University. And I also have a part-time private practice where I see a wider range, age range, from college students all the way to older adults.
Right. No, that's great. Thank you for that. So given the diagnosis of the first COVID case in December of 2019, we are now still sheltering in, and so there's been unprecedented efforts worldwide to practice social distancing. So, in addition to being socially isolated, we're also seeing an uptick in unemployment and just to name one, impact. So can you tell us why we're seeing so many medical professionals calling for early mental health intervention during this pandemic?
Sure. So there was basically a tremendous amount of loss and fear that happened suddenly for everyone. I think COVID shifted everyone's normal routine, their normal overall lives, where we were so accustomed to our daily routines of going to work and coming home. And, from that to having to basically quarantine and be at home 24/7 for the most part. And then even more severe, the actual loss of lives, essentially. So when I say tremendous fear, there's a tremendous fear of contracting the virus. And for those, unfortunately, who have either had the virus or who have had family members who've had the virus, they have had to bear witness to family members becoming very ill suddenly. For some people, it's been touch and go where they weren't sure whether or not their family member would survive. And then unfortunately, a lot of people, lost family members to the virus. And then because of the issue with contagion, the lost opportunity to funeralize or memorialize or really mourn the loss of a family member in the way that one would normally. So with social distancing, most people were not able to go to the hospitals and be at their loved ones' bedsides. Most people were not able to actually attend a funeral in person or a memorial service in person of a loved one, or even be in close contact with family members, usually during mourning, as they would normally. So a tremendous amount of lost opportunity, the actual loss of life, the fear of contracting the virus, the fear of when you have the virus of losing your life, as I understand it. Many people, even who survived the virus, oftentimes were not really sure how sick they were going to become. You know, it was unclear whether or not they would heal. So a lot of insecurity, life insecurity, which can obviously have a tremendous effect on mental health. It can cause people to feel basically a lot of post-traumatic stress symptoms, a lot of hypervigilance, a lot of anxiety. People likely are noticing changes and shifts in their mood. So feeling helpless, feeling hopeless, which of course affects one's mood. It causes people to often feel a chronic sense of sadness or chronic sense of fatigue. So I think given the very real shifts, has a tremendous effect on mental health for most of us.
So, you know, I think while some of us might not have the depression, but some words that I've heard media use around this time is anger, and I think you already mentioned grief. So can you help us understand why so many of us are just dealing with, the different steps of grief and what those steps are?
Certainly.
You can outline that.
Yeah, no problem. So, as we're talking about before, and I think a lot of psychotherapists are actually usually helping clients grieve in some way, shape, or form. That often can be a big part of the therapeutic intervention overall. Even pre-pandemic, in people's personal lives, oftentimes grief can be a major part of what brings them to treatment and to therapy, and what may be at the root of a lot of depression and anxiety. And when I say grief, I don't necessarily mean the death of a loved one or friend, but loss, disappointments, missed opportunities, lost expectations. So I think that this pandemic very much is representative of that, representative of, in every way, shape, and form, shifts in one's life that could be considered loss, essentially. And you talked about the steps or stages of grief. Now, normally that's, that popular knowledge, a lot of people know about sort of the 5 stages of grief. And it's important to note that they're not necessarily stepwise stages that everyone goes through in a linear fashion. Historically, there was the psychiatrist who wrote about these stages of grief. What I've read is that she meant it more sort of, these are observations essentially, that she observed people who were actually had terminal illness and their loved ones. She was observing them to sort of go through these different variation in emotion, so to speak. So it was really a way to frame it. So I say that to say that, the grieving process is not necessarily a stepwise or stage process, as much as people might recognize certain feelings and emotions that very much are associated with grief and loss. So you mentioned anger, of course, sadness, that is associated with depression oftentimes. So a feeling of helplessness, a feeling of hopelessness, feeling overwhelmed, denial. So I think, initially, even personally for me, I definitely, the first couple of weeks, was very much holding on to this almost fantasy that the virus would somehow magically disappear within the next couple of weeks. I mean, I remember waiting for sort of an authority figure, so to speak, to let us know that everything was okay and that we could go resume life as normal. And of course, as time went on, we learned that that is not the case. So, sort of me kind of experiencing my own sort of denial, so to speak, or not wanting to believe that COVID was as serious as it was. Confusion, shock, fear, all is associated with denial. And then, you know, the psychiatrist who came up with these stages of grief, talks about bargaining. And what she meant by that is, you know, struggling to find meaning. So basically, you know, where you're a sense of hopelessness or helplessness, where it's hard to even understand, you know, what can I get out of this, essentially, apart from feeling as though I'm suffering. And then eventually, in her model, in her frame, she talks about acceptance, which is where we kind of come to a certain peace about what's happening. So it's not necessarily you sort of collapsing and feeling apathetic about it, but you coming to a sense of understanding, you know, the realization that this is real, and so how can I respond to this? While holding on to a sense of life that maybe you experienced prior to COVID, or maybe you experienced prior to the loss, whatever that loss may be. There is another researcher by the name of Bonanno. He is out of Colombia, and he's written a lot in recent times about grief and loss. He wrote a lot about people's reactions to 9/11 and a lot of case studies of people who've experienced traumatic loss. And he found in his research that actually the stages of grief are one way to frame it. He actually found that we're actually hardwired, and this is maybe kind of the more hopeful end of things, is that we're hardwired to cope with loss, because death is a very natural part of human life. You know, as sad as it may be for us, it is a natural part of human life. So we are hardwired to cope with it. And he was saying in his research, he found that when people have a sudden loss, oftentimes what can be surprising and hopeful is sort of a certain found resilience, essentially, and the human capacity for resilience, which I think is something to hold on to, which is the fact that even though this is an extremely difficult time where a lot of real fear, you know, comes to the fore, and we're experiencing a lot of loss, you know, we have it within us, so to speak, organically to weather it. Now, of course, we could always use guidance, you know, in that department, but nonetheless, his research found that, you know, humans do have very much a natural capacity to cope with loss and difficult times.
Being home, what can we do to cope? You know, if we don't have access to a therapist right now, what are some things that we can do to cope, to help with friends or family members who really need our support right now?
So I think connecting with friends and family members is the first step. I mean, even as a therapist, a lot of my work with my own patients or clients has shifted from maybe shifted into more of a supportive mode. So, you know, normally wherein oftentimes therapists are often maybe looking for people's sort of personal vulnerability or their personal triggers that may exacerbate certain fears and distress. You know, this is very much a real fear and you know, real fear and loss, essentially, that's not clouded by people's own, you know, personal psychology. So I think connecting, reaching out to friends and loved ones, and that and also using that reciprocity. So building community at this time in a way that we can. We know that it's not going to be the same as how it used to be, where we're able to visit with each other or have in-person contact. It doesn't mean that it has to be all or nothing. And that's first and foremost what I think would be most helpful to think about, is just your frame of mind. How are you framing this time for yourself mentally? So number one, acknowledging that this is an extremely difficult time. Because often what psychotherapists know is that people sometimes, in defense of feeling distress, will almost be in denial or avoid the distress or become very judgmental and critical of it. You know, I shouldn't feel this way, or I wish this would go away. And what we know is that that can actually exacerbate duress, essentially. It doesn't necessarily help the symptom go away. Rather, acknowledging that you are feeling this way, it doesn't necessarily need to overtake you per se, but nonetheless, it's a real feeling, and validating that experience. So acknowledging that what you're feeling is very reasonable, whether it be anxiety, fear, sadness. Also too, you know, acknowledging that you're not, as you just said, neighbors, friends, etc., you're not alone in this feeling. And, you know, as human beings, we're very relational beings. And so just the thought that we're all in this together can be comforting and can feel like a source of support. Also, as I was just saying, as Dr. Bonanno's research has, you know, shown us that, you know, we are actually hardwired to cope with and manage through difficult times. You know, we're sort of made of tough stuff, so to speak. And keeping that in mind, you know, as, you know, even though you're feeling distressed, even though you're feeling anxious, and there's a lot of unknown, you know, oftentimes we naturally have the resilience to manage difficult times. And so keeping that frame in mind, then it doesn't become about, well, why am I feeling this way? I shouldn't feel this way. Let me just get rid of the feeling. Then it can shift into, well, how do I respond to this feeling? You know, how do I respond to my anxiety? How do I respond to my sadness? And, you know, I think kind of taking advantage of what we're already doing. So I think most people, for example, are already doing a lot of screen time, for example. So we're watching TV a lot, we're on our phones a lot, we're on our computers a lot, you know, during COVID, even more than before. So using that time actually to, you know, making your screen time effective for you, right? As in maybe going to different apps, you know, that help with managing anxiety, with managing distress, you know, meditation apps, mindfulness apps, so healthy apps, essentially. Encouraging sort of taking space for yourself. So again, keeping in mind your mental frame. Yes, of course, there's a lot of loss of daily routine, and people are unable to do maybe what they would normally do to feel good, but it doesn't have to be all or nothing. So this idea of accepting that, yes, there is a loss, but within this frame, you know, what can I do? What can I do? I may not be able to go to the gym, but perhaps I can, you know, do workouts virtually at home. So that's important. A third thing is, you know, creating a sense of normalcy for yourself. So yes, our routines were completely upended, but, you know, now we have to create a new routine, essentially. So making, you know, even though I think I saw this really funny meme of someone's commute route, and it was like the kitchen to the room to the bathroom or something. But, right. So sort of, you know, basically creating a daily routine in your home, you know, no matter how small the space is, including some structure in your day. And then lastly, you know, I think, as you said, acknowledging that we are relational, and again, it's not all or nothing. So even though you can't see a friend, you can connect with a friend in other ways, whether it be virtually, whether it be on the phone. And I also think it's important to, one of my colleagues reminded us the other day in a staff meeting, I think that there's a saying, and I don't know who said it, about how we may all be in the same water, but we're in different boats, you know, or not everyone is in the same boat, even though we're all navigating the same water, right? That water being the COVID situation, but not all of us are, you know, navigating it in the same way, certainly, and not all of us have the same resources to navigate it. So, or even the same frame, essentially. So, you know, oftentimes it can be very helpful to connect with people who are in a similar situation as you, right? So There's a difference between, let's say, a single mom, right, who may be quarantining with her child or her children, and she's having a very unique experience, different from somebody who is in a two-parent household, or different from someone who's single. So connecting with people who may be in a similar situation as you, checking in with each other, I think can also, again, help people to feel supported and in community. And that can have such a soothing effect, I think, on distress and helping to manage.
Yeah, no, I think it's interesting that you brought up using apps and the like to help soothe and probably get better sleep. I know there's definitely an app out there to do that. As you know, we invest in technology startups, and as I look through our portfolio of our underlying companies, I'm seeing an uptick in technology companies trying to solve for mental wellness issues. I think when we chatted, we talked about, on the consumer side, we have a company called Wobot, which is using artificial intelligence and chatbots as virtual therapists. And then we also have companies like Calm, which is the guided meditation and sleep. And so, also from a business to business perspective, we're seeing companies, offering companies and corporations, large corporations, the likes of Starbucks and Lyft and Uber, to help them help their employees. So through an investment in Kleiner Perkins, we have a company called Modern Health. And then also it's basically a virtual professional therapists and coaches and to help their employees. And more recently, one of our investments in a fund manager called IVP just did a round in Lyra Health, and that's again providing mental health benefits for employees and their dependents. What is your sense and what's your view in terms of virtual therapist? You're probably practicing that right now. So
yeah, definitely.
Does that work? Like, what are some of the merits and some of your concerns using that platform?
Yeah, so I can say yes. I mean, during COVID, I am using virtual therapy with all of my clients. I'm no longer seeing anyone in person. At the Howard Counseling Center, the campus was closed, so we did have to go to a virtual platform. In my private practice, I'm no longer seeing people in the office. I'm seeing people virtually. So I think I think of it as a viable alternative when in-person therapy is not feasible. And of course, this is an unprecedented time, so no one would ever have predicted that, this would count as in-person therapy, not being feasible at this time. But certainly this time it's necessary. And then there are other situations even prior to COVID, depending on where someone is geographically, there may be a shortage in therapists in general. And so being able to access a therapist virtually is also quite effective. Now, as I said, I consider it an alternative, a viable alternative when in-person therapy is not available. So of course there are some drawbacks, and that that is most therapists, no matter what their orientation or that is their philosophy in treatment and intervention, would likely say that the relationship between client and therapist is the foundation of the effectiveness of treatment therapy. And as you can imagine, there are things that you can relay in person that are hard to even relay, of course, when you can't see someone, but of course, even to have to see someone through a screen, it can be quite different than the in-person contact, just in terms of the feel of it. And sometimes it's hard to put into words. But I know, for example, basically, if we were to kind of frame it in a more concrete way, tracking facial expressions, basically with technology, sometimes it can be difficult to clearly hear someone in the same way that you'd be able to hear them behind a closed door in an office. So basically a lot of the nonverbal cues that we all
Right.
even unconsciously rely on,
Right.
especially, in therapy, can be a bit muted, let's say, even
Mm.
virtually, even when you are seeing someone through a screen. So those would be the drawbacks, but nonetheless, I think at a time like this, especially where we just can't see someone in person, it's definitely a viable alternative. Definitely.
Yeah. I
Mhm.
think you touched upon some really good points there in terms of, why venture capitalists are interested in this area right now. Um, and long before COVID, I think you mentioned
Certainly.
the shortage and the cost of therapists and
Mhm. Mhm.
um, how many people cannot afford it
Mhm.
because of
Mhm.
insurance and policy
Mhm.
guiding that. And also, I think more and more, and
Mhm.
please feel free to weigh
Yeah.
in, the
Yeah.
destigmatization of mental illness. I think
Mhm.
as a
Absolutely.
population, um, we're finding it to be okay to talk about
Mhm.
um, and to talk about, feeling depressed. And are you
Absolutely.
seeing
Yeah.
that more in your practice?
Absolutely. Especially, the younger the person is, I definitely think that
Mm,
there is this, there's not as much shame, I think,
right.
in acknowledging that you're having a mental health concern, or that you're feeling in distress psychologically. Um, there's certainly amongst college students, that there's an openness to talking about therapy. There's an openness to wanting therapy, and I think that's, and even
Mm-hmm.
in older patients as well. I think it's definitely becoming more accepted and more popular,
Mm-hmm.
and even within different fields. So when we talked before, I think you had mentioned, physicians now prescribing therapy,
Mm-hmm.
in addition to other interventions. So when
Mm-hmm.
physicians are thinking about prevention and wellness and lifestyle
Mm-hmm.
intervention, oftentimes now more than ever, they will recommend therapy,
Mm-hmm.
essentially. Yeah. Yeah. So there's
Yeah.
definitely a destigmat, it's very, very much destigmatized. And because of that, I think that creates a much higher demand for services.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah. No, I think that as I read up more about the technology helping solve mental health, at least
Hmm.
from a tech perspective, it's really helping those who are um, not quite in the very severe spectrum,
Hmm.
to
Hmm.
help a guide, to coach, if you
Yeah,
will, through
absolutely.
certain points in life or career. Um,
Hmm.
we
Yeah.
we can, I think we can all kind of relate with that.
Hmm.
Um, so the question back to using a chatbot
Uh-huh. Hmm.
and
Hmm.
using machine learning and artificial
Hmm.
intelligence. Um, I think the efficacy, to your point, I think that's still um, a big question for
Hmm.
tech-related mental wellness.
Hmm.
But how accurate do you think,
Hmm.
um, not accurate is probably not the right word, but how
Hmm.
effective do you think
Hmm.
tech-enabled mental wellness coach may have on a
Yeah.
population? Yeah.
Yeah. So I was kind of scrolling through the Wobot website and looking at, who they are and how they describe their service and their mission. And I really liked how the clear parameters with which they framed
Mm-hmm.
the service, because I do
Mm-hmm.
think the question is not so much whether or not tech can be of service. It's the
Mm-hmm.
question would be how. And one of the things that I noticed is that the owners of the company um, very much put it out there that they don't mean for Wobot to be a replacement of
Mm-hmm.
of human beings. Essentially, they don't mean for it to be a
Sure.
replacement of therapy, but more of an additional resource, more of a supplement.
Mm-hmm.
that very much hones in on a specific way of intervening with certain symptoms. Using CBT techniques, so cognitive behavioral techniques, specifically, I think they're using interventions with distorted thinking. So all or nothing thinking, or sometimes we call it catastrophic thinking, but basically helping to intervene with how people's thoughts may maintain feelings of anxiety, feelings of depression. So they were very clear about the fact that it doesn't necessarily replace therapy per se, but may be very, very helpful in terms of an additional resource and to supplement that intervenes with certain symptoms, essentially.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good way to think about that, as a supplement, as a secondary resource. Really. I just think there's still so much to be done on this topic, and I do think that technology will play a role, but they do have obstacles and barriers that they'll have to overcome, especially when it comes to efficacy and regulatory oversight. And, do these products have to be FDA approved, because they're, if they are claiming to be, clinically effective? I think that's something that we'll probably hear more on that
certainly
in the future. But thank you so much for agreeing to do this segment with us. I mean, it is a topic that's important, and especially during this time period. So we really appreciate your help on this.
Thank you for having me.